Economists generally see economic growth measured through GDP as a result of how much we spend, how much businesses are investing, how much government is spending, and the net level of exports. Put all that together, and supposedly you've got the future GDP outlook. But it's hard to predict, isn't it? And more importantly, how do you improve your situation? I mean, you can't export more if you don't produce stuff that other countries want to buy. So isn't the real potential for growth tied up in what you make and what you have that's needed to make what you make? Isn't it all a bit more complex than the top line figures that economists look at? And even if they get it right, isn't it simply reporting on things the way they are rather than looking at the potential to make growth better? That's what we look at today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Yes, what we're talking about today is the idea of economic complexity, that the success of an economy depends on the complexity of the set of products it produces and exports. The greater the range of products a country exports and the more diversified it is, the greater the potential for economic growth. That's about it, isn't it, Steve?
That's pretty much it. I mean, with the interesting insight out of the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which I highly recommend people to take.
It's great fun to look around because you spend hours.
Yeah, and I have too. It says we can analyze what's actually happened in international trade. Okay, we're not talking about theory here. We're saying what has actually happened, and they have a database called the standard SITC, the Standard International Trade Classification Database, which classifies products down to I think an 8-digit level, and then aggregates those into different higher entity aggregations. And without fail, the countries that advance most rapidly are the ones with the most complex industrial patterns. And the example that Cesar Hidalgo gives, one of the two major brains behind the whole project, is that if you have something like actually this is my favorite example, but I'll use it and try to remember Caesar's as I go. If you have a country where somebody produces surfboards and where somebody produces sails, you may consider putting the two together and producing sailboarding, which is the whole new industry. So it's a case that to actually build a new industry, it helps to already have another related industry that not particularly far away in terms of both physical distance and also in a sense an intellectual distance. They've done a wonderful job of taking the data and saying, for example, glass is an essential part of making a car because you have to be able to see out of it. So glass and cars are close together, whereas leather is slightly further away because, yes, you use leather for leather seats, but a lot of cars have vinyl. So you don't necessarily need leather where you do necessarily need glass. So, and then with that combination, you can produce a pattern of an overall economy's interrelation of industries.
Right. So long as you've got the infrastructure in that country to enable those industries to become intertwined. So this becomes a good argument, doesn't it? In fact, I was on the radio the other day talking about HS2, and I was trying to sort of make this point that you've got to look at infrastructure within a country so that it's not a case of just building up the north at the expense of the south. It's giving those companies in the north the ability to be able to communicate and work with companies in the south. And you can't expect the north to develop as a sort of an isolated country on its own. You're always going to be working with what is at the moment, the powerhouse in England, which is in the southeast of England. So you need infrastructure links that are going to enable that to happen. So this complexity will only happen if you've got the infrastructure to support it.
Yeah, and I just remember what I said. A good example. He said that if you think about the theory of comparative advantage, that implies that the countries which are high up the production scale are going to be producing highly complex devices, such as like nuclear power stations and jets and so on. And countries lower down will specialize in less technological than, say, for example, nails. Now, when you look at Germany produces both nuclear power stations and engines and nails. In other words, it isn't the case that countries specialize at a high end versus a low end. It's the best countries are the ones that do everything, and Germany is one of the top examples. And another thing, which normally you and I look at it in terms of what products are exported by which country to which other countries, which is this rectangular grid where they break it into the different classifications. But I think the most interesting thing is the overall network effect they've created of all industries for all countries. Have you looked at that side of it yet?
Yeah, I have. Yeah. And is that which is a very complicated map.
It is, yeah. But what to use it? What you do is you click on one particular point. So, for example, the UK. I'm just clicking on one of the points right now. Produces paints and varnishes aqueous, and it doesn't have to produce it; it exports them. And this is one point I have a bit of a potential criticism of the actual way that they decide the level of complexity. We'll come back to that later. But you look at it and you point at it, and then sends out lines linking to other circles, which are essential parts of that industry, and saying, "Do you produce that as well?" And by the looks of it, the UK does not export glues and adhesives, which is a related industry to producing paints and varnishes.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, so therefore to be importing
unless it produces it all domestically. But I mean, if it produces domestically.
That's the point.
Yeah.
That's the point.
And this is one thing I've been thinking about as well, looking at all of this is, what about if you've got a very complex model, but you don't export a great deal because you've got a big domestic market?
Yeah, and this is the other possibility. This is showing I'm showing what it exported in 2017, looking at this amazing cobweb map of the country. But I can't see a way to see imports the same way.
Yeah.
Now, of course, you could show imports the same way. Now, if you have product, like for example, again, that example I've given of glues there, if glues are essential product and you're not exporting them and you're not importing them, then you must be making them domestically and not exporting them. So to some extent, this map may be misleading. And it's not how the map itself. The map is going to be quite realistic because it shows if you're going to produce something, you've got to have the other inputs from somewhere. But it's how they then interpret that to say just how complex your overall economy is. I'm skeptical about whether they could improve the way they analyze it by not just looking at what you export and the complexity of that, but looking at what you export, what you import, where the gaps are, therefore assume you produce it domestically, and then look at the complexity of that combined measure.
I grew up in the northeast of England. Most of the glue was sniffed there. So I don't know whether it was produced domestically or not.
That probably is an essential part of producing comedy at a later stage.
Maybe, exactly. I wasn't partaking. I hate to that.
Okay. But you didn't inhale. Okay.
I didn't inhale. No, that's right.
Yeah.
I just stuck my nostrils together. So this is it's being used as a fairly accurate predictor, though, isn't it, of GDP growth?
Yeah, very accurate. This is they then backtest the data, so they'll make predictions about future GDP growth given the current pattern that your economy has and where you could be developing and what is appearing to happen in the data as well.
Just based on this data itself, because I would have thought things like, the population growth, the level of education, that they'd all be factors. But I guess that sort of is interpreted in the data anyway, because if you...
Yeah. So the data it's actually a very useful guide to say how sophisticated is your particular economy?
Yeah.
What can it produce? What would be a good direction for to move its production in? And so they ultimately produce an overall rating as what they call the ECI, Economic Complexity Indicator value.
Yeah.
And I presume that the top country here, the top country is Japan. The second is Switzerland.
Yeah, that's because they make cuckoo clocks and very nice chocolate and dodgy bank accounts. Enormous diversity in that country. Look, if you want to hear the full version of this podcast, then you need to subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen. If you become a supporter there, then you'll get access to the full version of this podcast and all the other hundreds of podcasts in this series. We keep on adding to them each week as well. So hopefully you'll do that. We'll see you back here again. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Thanks for listening.